I'm delighted to welcome you to this unique event tonight, part of a collaboration between La Trobe University and our research partners at the Australian Ballet. The Australian Ballet and La Trobe University have been official partners since 2017, and this partnership has centred on optimising dancer performance and health. So it's been located largely in the sciences, in the health sciences. La Trobe researchers in sport and exercise medicine have worked with the Australian Ballet's internationally respected injury prevention and rehabilitation team to make a real impact on elite performers and sports. The Australian Ballet's groundbreaking Oscar production, which is based on the life and writings of literary giant Oscar Wilde, has been the catalyst to further deepen our partnership. It's been an opportunity for us to reach into the humanities, another area in which La Trobe is incredibly strong. A team of La Trobe experts in history, sexualities, and creative writing has been assisting to bring Wilde's life, times, and works to the stage with integrity and compassion. And I want to tell you a little bit about that project. What started as a request from the Australian Ballet's artistic team for an academic paper to help inform the production's historical setting turned into a workshop with their dancers to help inform character development. And now that's also turned into a book, The Importance of Being Oscar. You'll all be receiving a copy of this book in the mail, which will make the perfect companion to the Oscar performance at the Regent Theatre. And that season opens on the 13th of September. Hopefully you'll want to be there and tell all your mates about it too. We have a wonderful panel of experts here tonight. We have a participating chair, Professor Dennis Altman. He's going to introduce the other speakers, but I'm going to give you a little heads up on Dennis. Dennis first came to attention with the publication of his book, Homosexual, Oppression and Liberation, which he published in 1972. He doesn't look a day older than that now, does he?
Thank you.
His most recent books are God Save the Queen, The Strange Persistence of Monarchies, and Death in a Sauna. Dennis is Vice-Chancellor's Fellow and Emeritus Professor of Politics at La Trobe. He was President of the AIDS Society of Asia and the Pacific from 2001 to 2005, and he was listed by the Bulletin as one of the 100 most influential Australians ever. Ever is a big word. Dennis is patron of the Australian Queer Archives and of the Pride Foundation, where the proceeds from tonight's tickets are going. There's a lot for Dennis to cover, so I'm going to hand over to him to get tonight's discussion underway. Enjoy.
Thanks, Claire. Let me just begin by saying what an extraordinary and wonderful experience it's been for a lot of us at the Trobe University to collaborate with the Australian Ballet. I think it has been a team that is quite unique in the history of universities, where we've had academics, marketing, events people, all working together for the last few months and working particularly with the ballet around a better understanding of Oscar Wilde. Now, if you ask the average person, I think there are three things we all know about Oscar Wilde. We know the importance of being earnest, we know the picture of Dorian Gray, and we know that Oscar Wilde was convicted for gross indecency, served 2 years, 2 very unpleasant years in jail, and died in exile in France. And some of you may actually have seen the memorial to him in the Père Lachaise cemetery. And to talk about Oscar, to talk about the ballet, we have an extraordinary group of people who come from very, very different backgrounds. I'm going to briefly introduce them, then I'm going to throw a question to each of them in turn. First on my left is David Hallberg, who's the director of the Australian Ballet. David has a quite extraordinary and wonderful itinerary that began in South Dakota and came to Australia via pretty well every well-known ballet company in the world, including the Bolshoi. it is, I think, testament to how significant the Australian Ballet is that David was appointed director. Next to David is Christos Tsiolkas, who most of you will know as one of our best-known and most prolific novelists. Christos, in addition to being a novelist, is also a playwright and a librettist, and an opera based on the death of Dr. Duncan, the law lecturer who was drowned in the Torrens River in 1972 by South Australian police. That opera, which has been staged in both Adelaide and Sydney, I hope devotedly will come to Melbourne. Next to Christos, we have my colleague Alexis Harley, and I want to recognise that along with Alexis, my colleagues Timothy Jones and Noel Maloney have formed this extraordinary group of people in the humanities at La Trobe, all of whom who knew much more about Oscar Wilde and the late 19th century than I did. I now know a lot because, despite my talkativeness, I listen to them at times. Alexis is the author of a couple of extraordinary books, and the title, I have to read it because I love it so much, is Bees, Science and Sex in the Literature of the Late 19th Century. Alexis, the challenge will be if you can bring bees into the discussion of Oscar. And then at the end of the panel, the end of the stage, not the end of the panel, Tobias Fulton. Tobias is a classicist in the full sense of the word, someone who actually understands the contemporary relevance of the classics to understanding the ways in which, over time, people like Oscar, who was in modern terms a homosexual, a word that was not in common use at the time he was convicted. Oscar was convicted for gross indecency, not for homosexuality or sodomy. And Tobias brings that historical knowledge along with the fact that Tobias is also a curator of a very popular and I believe forthcoming event called Greek Love at the Hellenic Museum. So I thought we'd start by asking David to tell us a little bit about why the ballet chose this as a subject, and tell us as much as you feel able to about the structure and the formation of the ballet around the life of Oscar Wilde.
Sure. Without spoiling it, because you're all buying tickets, I have to say. Yes, thank you. Why this ballet? Well, Oscar Wilde, I think, needs a little introduction. And I think, first off, there's the side of the stories that he wrote. The Nightingale and the Rose, Picture of Dorian Gray, Importance of Being Earnest, which specifically The Nightingale and the Rose really complements the balletic art form, a bird, making bird-like movements, all of that's in the ballet. But for me, as artistic director of the company, what resonates even deeper is the life that Oscar led, the homosexual he was. And some of you may be shocked to hear this or not shocked. Ballet is an extremely heteronormative art form, shockingly, because I am a gay man. I had a career of 20 years, but I played a straight guy on stage all the time. And that the fact that this is considered bold sometimes shocks me when I start to unpack it, that this is still considered a bold move for a ballet company, but it is. And we are sort of balancing between, in the work itself, two stories, The Nightingale and the Rose, which anchors Act 1, and The Picture of Dorian Gray, which anchors Act 2. And throughout the ballet, Christopher Wheeldon, who's the choreographer, has created this sort of, biographical story of Oscar Wilde's life, the trial, the time he spent in jail. So why this story? I think, one, for the obvious reasons that he wrote, and he had such unbelievable wit in his writing, and that really complements ballet. But also, I really believe in telling stories that people can resonate with, that aren't just Clara and the Nutcracker, which I love Clara and the Nutcracker. I danced it many times myself, and classical ballet and the classical repertoire is a beautiful part of our art form. But people, I feel, need to resonate in a different way with ballet. And you'd be, well, I'm proud, and you'd be surprised that in the studio, there are people in the studio now, when we're having created all the steps already, that are in tears because they've never felt like they've been properly represented on stage. And I feel that it's a really great step for ballet in general, but for the Australian ballet to tell stories like this. And no one to tell a story like this than someone like Christopher Wilde. Christopher Wilde has created a lot of work in the ballet world, story works, Shakespeare, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, but he's also created some amazing Broadway musicals, MJ the Musical, which is coming to Australia based on Michael Jackson, American in Paris. So he's won a lot of Tony Awards. He's a great storyteller. And I was really interested in how he would tell the story of Oscar Wilde, the stories of Oscar Wilde, because he will do it in an elegant way, in a voice of quality, but also through the Trobe in a very researched way. And I think those three things really balance well with such a life that Oscar Wilde led through the voice of Christopher Wilde and through the company of the Australian Ballet.
I'm going to pick up from what you said and throw something at Tobias, which is, I know, not quite the order I'd forecast.
Here we go.
But there you are.
Curveball.
Because I just want to quote something that actually comes from the book that you're going to receive, which is, when Wilde was on trial, he explained himself, and I'm now quoting, in relation to the love between Jonathan and David described in the Old Testament, to classical Greek love between men, and Renaissance European poetry. And I think it's that reference to going back to some mythical image of the classical Greek relationship. And I'll just throw in one thing before you answer, which is, if you read accounts of the trial, it's never quite clear if the judge is more horrified by the possible sexual connections than he is by the breach of class lines.
I think it's a breach of class.
At various points, yes. But I'll leave that to you, Tobias, to expand on.
Yes, so I personally, in my research, am very interested in how people look to the past to find understanding within themselves, particularly when it comes to desire and identity. And Oscar Wilde is one of the many people in the 19th century, particularly for elite gentlemen, who have a classics background, so we'll be learning about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And within these texts, it is very hard to not come across the homoerotic undertones of, say, Plato's Symposium, or even anecdotes from Plutarch, and all the poetry that comes out, all the way from Sappho to Catullus, as we were talking about earlier. And in the 19th century, as we've already mentioned, there's not this idea of a homosexual identity. It's barely in its infancy. But what is happening at that time is many people are reading these texts, these ancient histories, and finding resonance, finding their desires within the past. And Oscar Wilde really does this in his work. You can see it from a mile away if you know what you're looking for. So, for example, the picture of Dorian Gray, within the title itself, Dorian, may be a very, very, very small connection to these people in ancient Greece called the Dorians. And they may have been, this was around the 8th century to the 5th century, that's where their populace, when they were, like, I guess, their height. But they may have, supposedly, to other ancient historians, been the ones to first have homoerotic relationships within each other within that society, and then supposedly it spread throughout ancient Greece. So even with the word Dorian itself, Oscar Wilde is using that to kind of show these subcultural codes.
Alexis, I think maybe it'd be good for you to pick up from there. And of course, there is a whole tradition in 19th century Britain that I think Wilde draws on, in addition to the references back to the Greeks and to the Bible. There is also, of course, Beau Brummel, the sense of being a dandy, right?
Yeah, great. I mean, the theme of Greek... So I guess what we're seeing is a community that is reaching for a vocabulary to talk about something,
yes, exactly,
for which there isn't yet a clear vocabulary. And the Greek kind of prototype that is popularised by someone called John Addington Symonds, who wrote this pamphlet called Greek Love and would circulate it to men in the sort of intellectual culture that he thought might be sympathetic to it, or perhaps it was a wooing device. Here, read my pamphlet. I think he was a key driver of this idea of Greek love, and that as a kind of set of terms that could be used. He also talked about, excuse my atrocious French accent, l'amour l'impossible, so the impossible love, which is perhaps a kind of forerunner to Wilde's line in his trial where he refers to the love that dare not speak its name, although he's quoting from Alfred Douglas then. But yeah, there are all sorts of other there's a whole lot of gender play that's been around over the course of the 19th century, going back to the kind of high romantic era with people like Beau Brummel who are inventing a sort of dandyism. There's not a clear, or certainly not a universally legible correlation between dress and sexuality. And so Wilde, who's characterised by Gilbert and Sullivan as walking through Piccadilly with a poppy or a lily in his medieval hand, as engaging in this kind of dandyism, isn't necessarily identifiable through that dandyism as someone who's engaged in same-sex sexual relationships. But there's an emerging code that is legible to the people to whom it needs to be legible, and the green carnation that Wilde famously wore and that his acolytes kind of took up becomes one such sort of code, a bit like the banana in your shopping trolley on a Friday night.
Yes, I should apologise on behalf of the Trobe University. We did not produce green carnations for the panel.
No, tragically.
But Christos, I think let's now switch to the present. I'm curious, you as one of our best-known gay writers, how much have you been influenced by Wilde? How important has Wilde been, do you think, in your intellectual and creative endeavours?
It's been terrific to listen to all of you talk about Wilde in that historic context, because I think I was saying to Tobias, just as we were talking off stage, that I was born in 1965, so I was a precocious reader, I know that, but it felt like I had known about what happened to Wilde, so that third element of what we all know about Wilde, that he was arrested for, not for homosexuality, but that there had been a famous trial, that he was really significant to the English literature, and I think I had a bit of a resistance because it felt like, even on the classical idea, the notion of a classical Greece, as someone from a Greek background that had what is my relationship to that, to that Greekness? It felt like it was more Western European, a relationship, that it was something that was part of who I wanted to be or was struggling to be. Then these things happened, and one of them was, I remember because Dad picked me up, so I was still living at home. I went and saw Fassbinder's Querelle, and it had a quote from the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which is the astonishing poem that Oscar Wilde wrote when he was in jail. Each man kills the thing he loves. And I started reading the Ballad of Reading Gaol, and I was profoundly moved by it. And then I read Dorian Gray, and I think it's one of the most magical novels I've ever read, and completely complex novels I've read. And it's still, to me, it has a specific sense that I respond to it when I read and reread it, which is something to do with a thing called the closet. But I also think there is a kind of intricate puzzle about what is an ethical life hidden in the novel that also fascinates me, and I keep returning to. So those aren't at all influences. I just think I love that poem. I love that book. I deeply love that novel. What was really influential was reading Wilde's *The Soul of Man Under Socialism*, which is a long essay, and I'll put it in a context. I'll be quick. I've talked a lot about one of the most profound periods of my life was when, as a young lad, I went into Eastern Europe just after the fall of communism, and so. As someone who had grown up in a left-wing world and with those politics, to be confronted with also what was the historic legacy of this politics I championed. And I remember being in what is now the Czech Republic, what was Czechoslovakia then, just after the Velvet Revolution, and I'm being in a little cafe off Venceslas Square, like the main square, and someone was doing a recital of a reading from Soul of Man Under Socialism, which is basically a humanist response to what it would be like to not live in an equal world. Like, there's no Marxist dialectics in it. It's not and it was just there's an element of hope that I find in that essay that I don't want to let go of. And I remember speaking with an East German woman because she knew English, and I was in this cafe, and she said, I'll paraphrase something like, "Imagine if socialism was envisaged by someone like Oscar Wilde and not like that Puritan arsehole Lenin." And I thought that's kind of always stayed with me. That's been, I think the fall. I mean, I love the plays. They're just so enticing and magical and fun, and I love the wit of all of that. I don't want to separate that, but I think the tragedy of what happened to Wilde, the fact that I think Soul of Man Under Socialism, I think that Reading Gaol, I think that De Profundis all came out of that experience, is really, that's been an influence of like how you deal with the fall. Does that, yeah.
Well, I think it's something I'd like to come back to with the others on the panel, but can I just raise something with you, David? And it's something that I think we all had to struggle with as we were working together. And that was getting the balance between Wilde's the celebrity, the success. And it's symbolised by the fact that Wilde's trial took place in 1895 when he was at his absolute peak of theatrical success. That was the year The Importance of Being Earnest opened. And I think I'm correct, someone on the panel will correct me if I'm wrong, that they pulled his name off the marquee at the theatre where The Importance of Being Earnest was being played. But I think I'm right, and I think, Alexis, you know about this. There were, I think, 3 of his plays simultaneously going on in London, and it involved 3 of the best-known actresses of the time, whom I know all appear in the ballet, David. So I think the real question is, how does one get the balance? How, in working through the ideas for the ballet, does one balance Wilde, the celebrity, the success, the writer, and indeed the married man with children, with Wilde, the man who ends up in prison for his sexuality?
Ballet is a very hard art form because it's nonverbal. And, well, it's predominantly nonverbal. And taking a story or a life like Oscar Wilde and the stories that he wrote is probably an academic's nightmare, in fact. Because
there are worse ones.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say.
As the people in the
You
front
know
row
nothing.
know.
because we have to take liberty of story through movement. But that's where the choreographic voice is paramount. And that's where I have such faith in Christopher Wheeldon, because he has the ability to deeply research with Trobe, with you, through his readings, the life of Oscar. Yes, the juxtaposition of his celebrity and also the trial and the fall, but also intertwining these stories. And I think that's something that we struggle with as an art form, is finding voice, choreographic voice that actually is of a certain quality, truth be told.
I thought that, when I heard Dennis's question, I was thinking of, it seemed perfect that you're using Nightingale in a way of, as a response or a way of dealing with that element of the story as well. Because that's one of the deepest, as another love I had of Oscar was reading those stories to nieces and nephews when they were young, and they're beautiful.
They are, yeah.
And I guess is that integration being done. How does the fairy tale talk to the
the fairy tale talks to the balletic vocabulary and the technique of ballet. It's the more balletic part of the evening of the work, and it was important for us commissioning the work, and also for Christopher to tell this story, and we do show the trial and we show the time he spent in jail, but then also ballet is a beautiful art form, and The Nightingale and the Rose is a beautiful story, and we have this nightingale intertwined through the entire ballet, actually, kind of coming in and unraveling the story, and she's got beautiful bird-like movement, and I think that softens it a bit. And also because we have at times quite conservative audiences that love ballet, and this is why a story like this is bold for us, because it tells about queer identity, but we're also showing really the beauty of the art form through the story, through the technique, through the dancers. So it's we're juggling.
And of course, the queer identity only emerges, and I hope I'm not giving away too much, towards the end of Act 1, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, I think it's important for people to understand. It was not Wilde is not uncommon to have been married, to have had children, and as an upper-class man, he had the freedom, certainly his wife would not have had, to go out and pick up rent boys. And in fact, one of the things interesting that came up several times in our discussions was a bit of an unease about the age differential. The fact that Oscar Wilde not only broke class barriers, but he liked men who, shall we say, were slightly younger than he was. I don't know, Tobias, do you have any reflections on how this might be an attempt to... No, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but it seems to me this is where falling back on some sort of Socratic model becomes your defence, right?
Yes, so he did use the Socratic model, or the Platonic model, whichever you want to call it, of pederasty. Now, I warn you, that is a very hard word to listen to as a modern age, but we do have to understand that the world of the ancient Greeks is not exactly like ours and vice versa. Effectively, what pederasty was an older man, the erastes, and a younger boy between the ages of 14 to 18, the eromenos, and it would be a mentorship. It could be sexual. It often was. We have a lot of evidence on pottery to suggest this as well. But it was also a way of education. It was a way to prepare young males to, become a citizen of the polis, of the city, and to really equip them. It could take different shapes and forms around the ancient world. It was well into the Roman Empire as well. But this idea of pederasty or a pederastic relationship was kind of taken advantage of in the 19th century to legitimise these types of relationships, especially in higher education and in schools and things like that.
And I think, Alexis, it might actually be useful if you were to explain the way in which the laws in Britain were changed, only, in the decade before Wilde's trial, partly because there was a great concern about, there was obviously a very big prostitution world in London, well, not just in London, and the concern led to a change in the law, which then made it possible to try Wilde on somewhat different grounds to those that would have existed prior to those changes.
I feel like you've explained that in your question, Dennis. But to reiterate Dennis's point, in the 1880s, there was a gripping expose of child prostitution published in the Pall Mall Gazette, titled "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon," and it was exposing the systemic, prolonged rape of girls for money, and they were being pimped on an absolutely horrendous scale, and so this was all being exposed. And this scandalised Britain, something that they had known about but kind of disavowed was now brought into plain sight, and it gave rise to a set of laws regulating sexual behaviour and, importantly, raising the age of consent for girls from 12 to 16. And at that time, there was no age of consent for boys or men, and that really wasn't perceived as an issue. But this suite of legislation, mostly relating to the age of consent for girls and mostly designed to protect girls from sexual assault, became that period was used in order to introduce a new piece of legislation which made a criminal offence an act of gross indecency between men. And exactly what gross indecency between men was never specified. It didn't indicate any particular sexual act. It was very amorphous, and the Wilde trial became really important in giving shape to what exactly that crime was meant to be. Although not a lot of shape, in fact. It still remained quite an unclear piece of legislation. But you said it perfectly well.
I defer to you on that.
It's really difficult. I mean, I'd like to know how you do. I mean, the process that you've all been engaged with is really fascinating about how you go into history, right? We contemporary audience, we are shocked to hear about the ages of the boys. It's equally shocking that 11-year-old girls were cleaning out the ship bowls of people in houses. That this is the era, one or the other, of young children being sent to work, and so that's what did childhood mean in this era? I think one of the hard things of trying to do history in an artistic way is to how do you deal with those contradictions and not speak with smugness from the 21st century, which actually, So I'm actually curious about how that process of talking about that has been.
And I think, David, that's been one of the things where we were working with the dancers, right, to understand that how people saw themselves in the 1890s doesn't necessarily map onto how people see themselves in 2024. The language we now use, you might have noticed I deliberately said prostitution. If I was speaking of contemporary politics, I would, of course, say sex work. And that sort of symbolises the fact that the language we now use was not available. And I think that that's something that your company has actually struggled with. Struggle may be the wrong word. You have actually grappled with that, I think, in a really interesting way.
We've had to confront it, even today, because the work is complete, the steps are created, it's 98% there in terms of choreography. The costumes have a ways to go, but TikTok. Even today, we took the company together. It's a company of 80 dancers, and we said, there are stark differences between time then and time now, and what is considered acceptable socially, what is age appropriate. But Chris did say, I am asking no one in the cast to portray anyone under the age that you are. So there are no underage characters on stage, and that's the stance that he took. But there has been levels of uncomfortability in terms of society then, but also in terms of there are straight identifying men who are kissing men on stage for the very first time. And we have an intimacy coordinator. We've made sure it's a safe environment for everyone to dive into the work and assess levels of comfortability. But what I have found so interesting is, yes, there's kissing, two men kissing on stage. There's all those displays of homosexuality. But I played Romeo for 20 years.
Yeah.
And
He's pretty young.
That's longer than...
And no one ever asked me if I was comfortable kissing my Juliet. And society expects, in the ballet world, oh, we accept you as a gay man, but get on with it. And so now I'm proud that we are creating an environment that's safe for everybody, but we're not saying to the straight men in the company, get on with it. But that's what was expected of me for 20 years. So, and we're doing it, I feel, and I've actually been shocked at how committed the company has been. Committed the straight men have been playing Oscar. And I was telling
Yes, you actually have a clip, I think, where three of the dancers who dance Oscar talk about this.
Yeah, and they're relating themselves to playing Oscar. And it's been quite moving for many people to address issues like this, which are issues the ballet world has almost never, if not ever, addressed.
Can we take up another aspect of Oscar Wilde altogether, which is Oscar Wilde in some ways is one of the first celebrities in the way that we today use that term. I think somewhere in one of the things we've written, he's referred to as the first influencer. Right? Yeah. I'm not sure how accurate this is.
Oscar would be a TikToker.
But
where would Byron?
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking Byron.
Byron's probably the.
And,
But he was certainly, and my understanding is his celebrity status began, interestingly, when he went to New York.
Sure, yeah. I mean...
Sorry, teamwork here isn't always perfect.
So, as Dennis said, Wilde's celebrity status was really catalysed by that trip to America where he was received with Wilde enthusiasm. That had to happen at some point, didn't it? Yeah. Although there are kind of reconstructive histories so people at Oxford are always saying that, Wilde became a celebrity at Oxford and so on. But it does seem that trip to America was really explosive for him. He was, aside from Ballad of Reading Gaol, which I agree is such a powerful and poignant poem, and I was thinking of that couplet from it, "He that lives more lives than one, more deaths than one must die," which is so germane to your question about Wilde's many kind of selves or many lives and how we can navigate between them. But besides that, he was a terrible poet, in my view, a really, really bad poet. Yeah. And he began...
There's bits of Reading Gaol.
He began his poetic career... he began his writing career as a poet. His first publications were books of poems. And over that period, I think he was really just coasting on his personality because the writing really wasn't that good. But he starts to emerge as the 1880s move into the 1890s as this incredibly witty, brilliant writer. And Soul of Man Under Socialism, I agree, is just the most fantastically important piece of writing. If you read one thing by Oscar Wilde, and I'm sure you've all read many things by Oscar Wilde, but if there's one thing by Oscar Wilde that you haven't read, I urge you to read Soul of Man Under Socialism. He talks about property as demoralising the rich, and he talks about the punishment of people who commit crimes as more brutalising to society than the crimes themselves. So all of these incendiary observations that are, arguable. I'm not going to sort of defend them to you, but they are so provocative still, 130 years later, and so beautifully expressed, of course. I mean, in ways that just make you.
I think that was the point of that East German woman, was to say all these tracks and all these, all of Lenin and all that could go. That no longer spoke, but that essay still spoke. It survived.
That's right. Yeah. And it's fully automated luxury communism before that exists. So it's a very exciting piece of work. Anyway, where are we going with this? America.
Well, no, I think. What I think is interesting is why Wilde is still such an important figure in our cultural history. And I was very struck by accident. I remembered and I found that when Susan Sontag wrote one of her best-known essays, Notes on Camp, in the early 1960s, she actually dedicates it to Oscar Wilde, which I think suggests that Wilde has had an ongoing impact on writing, certainly an ongoing impact on theatre, as we saw most recently with that extraordinary production by the Sydney Theatre Company of the importance, of the picture of Dorian Gray. But I'm curious, because both you and Christos have talked about Soul of the Man Under Socialism, should we remember Wilde as more than perhaps the wittiest playwright in the English language? And I think you're saying, yes, we should.
Yes, absolutely. I wish we would, yeah. So, I mean, as you said in your introduction, Dennis, he's remembered for Importance of Being Earnest, which is the wittiest play of the 19th century, right? George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde. They're the two Victorian playwrights that are still performed, still remembered. And there were hundreds, but those are the two. And Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a very different work. And across those two texts, you get some sense of Wilde's repertoire. But those essays, like Soul of Man Under Socialism, Decay of Lying, etc., Portrait of Mr. W.H., those are powerful works of cultural criticism that, of course, are of their time, and there are ways in which they're, profoundly dated. But they are also still deeply provocative for the modern reader. I mean, shocking in many ways, and I think absolutely worth the reading. And yet they tend not to have the same canonical status as some of the more accessible.
Yeah. It's so hard to know, isn't it, in terms of that question, Dennis, of what will be 50 years hence of I mean, I think people will still be chuckling at the plays. I think the novel Dorian Gray will stay, because I think I said it spoke to me about a particular space called the closet, but I think it speaks to a lot of spaces. But that experience I had where I was already beginning to resist his history, I wonder, once the question of his trial, the tragedy, the fall, what I've called the fall, has receded, I don't actually know what it'd be, and it'd be interesting. I mean, it's a speculation, but I don't actually know what it will be.
Mm-hmm. Wilde in 2050.
Yeah. You know, where those questions that are that you're having to deal with in the making of this production may be asked in different ways, and kind of I mean, what you hope is that the person who has got your role in 50 years does the ballet in another way that speaks to that audience, to that in the future.
I think that's what was so successful about the Sydney theatre production, is that it came at it from a different perspective. And I think, I hope Oscar, the ballet, comes at it with a different perspective. And in 50 years, it's a different perspective. And that's, I think, the beauty of Kip Williams, of Christopher Wheeldon, of the choreographic or the theatrical directive mind, is that they can take material and see it with a fresh perspective 50 years later.
I'm actually curious, David, because I know very little about ballet, but my sense is it is very unusual to construct a ballet around the life of an individual, a living individual.
It's not common. We tend to stick to fairy tales.
Indeed.
But
how many times can you dance the Nutcracker?
Yes, exactly. We do the Nutcracker at the Sydney Opera House in December. We'll see you there.
I thought I'd give you a plug for that, yes.
Thank you. Nevertheless, Rudolf Nureyev was probably the greatest, one of the greatest male dancers to ever perform. And they created the Bolshoi Theater before the war, created a work based on the life of Nureyev. But it's this huge subject to tackle, whether it's Oscar Wilde or Rudolf Nureyev or whoever, because it has to be through movement. And it's really tricky to get plot lines, narrative, dramatic arc, communicated through the body. I just stressed myself out. Friday the 13th is when we open.
David, maybe we should give a hint to the audience, which is they should read The Rose and the Nightingale before they go to the ballet.
Yes, yeah. But also, I think that's our job as a choreographer, as an artistic director, is to create a work where you actually sit down and you don't have to do a ton of research beforehand, Tom Stoppard style or something. You can sit down and be like, actually, that totally makes sense to me. Oh, that she's having an affair with him, and whatever the storyline is. I think that's the choreographic job.
That's great. Sorry. That was great.
Sorry, I missed that.
And I wanted to go back to Christos's question about what Wilde in 50 years will be. And I was just thinking earlier about how Wilde in the 1950s wasn't gay anywhere that you look. I've got my Penguin edition of De Profundis, the letter that he wrote to his lover, Alfred Douglas, from prison, is prefaced by an editor, Hesketh Pearson, who refers to Wilde's friend, Alfred Douglas. And biographies of the 1950s just omit the fact that that he was the subject of this punitive criminal trial, or they gloss it over. It's amazing the disavowal that was going on. But I think perhaps, maybe this is optimistic, but I think in 50 years his sexuality won't be particularly remarkable.
Thank you for saying that.
It will be understood as having been in a particular historical context, life-defining. But as sexuality is for most of us at some point.
But I think that's already true. I mean, I have this very vivid memory of doing an interview with a very young cadet reporter and making a comment about it was only 20 or 30 years ago that men were put in prison for having sex together, and the reporter stopped the recording and said, "I don't believe you." And I think that in that sense, the story of Oscar Wilde remains relevant.
It needs to be told,
as an indication, and let us remember, as an indication of the reality for people in most parts of the world. And in fact, I didn't intend to do this, but it's given me a perfect moment to remind you all that the proceeds from tonight are going to support queer refugees and asylum seekers. And the thing that I think I'm proudest of is my role in the Pride Foundation and the work we've been able to do. And I think in that sense, the full story of Oscar Wilde will continue to be relevant. I suspect, David, that there are many countries where you would not be able to stage this ballet.
There absolutely wouldn't. In fact, the Ballet Nureyev created it at Bolshoi Ballet in 2016 can no longer be performed in Russia because it has, his famous lover was a dancer named Eric Brun, and there's depiction of them falling in love. They're not kissing on stage, God forbid, but it isn't performed anymore. So yes is the answer to your question.
I've been getting signals that we are coming towards the end. So I'm going to ask all of you for final comments, which may indeed be in the form of questions, comments, things that you think we haven't covered. And unfairly, Tobias, I'm going to start with you and move to this end of the stage.
No, that's okay. I'm a classicist. I'm very kind of out of my depth here. But I'm very honoured to be here because I came to Oscar Wilde, it was a bit of backwards engineering. I actually came through research on two figures in the ancient world called Hadrian and Antinous, and I will find any excuse to talk about them ever. But it was the Emperor Hadrian of the 2nd century CE and had a male beloved called Antinous who would have had that pederastic relationship. And when I was doing research for my master's degree, and I was trying to find if they had any value or resonance with queer identity and queer desire in more contemporary and the modern world, I found a paper that mentioned that Oscar Wilde had mentioned it in The Picture of Dorian Gray, where Basil says the face of Antinous was to late Greek sculpture is what Dorian Gray will be to me. And that resonated with me very deeply, because it was this continuing line of looking at the past to resonate, to find oneself, to find tools of legitimacy and identity in the 19th century where ideas of sexuality and ideas of identity were starting to change. And, we get that continuation today. We still have a lot of people looking to the past. I do it myself, my body is covered in it, to understand who I am, why I feel desire, where these desires resonate in the past and are similar, and also why the past is very, very different, either if we're looking at the 19th century or we're looking 2,000 years ago. The more alien it is, the more fascinated I am, actually, because I think it gives us room to look at how sexuality and how gender and how identity can change and continue to evolve, and we don't have to be locked into certain categories. So that's kind of how I came to Oscar Wilde, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. So thank you very much. Oh, no.
Facebook presented me with an ad for this event, and it was exciting to see my name on the screen. But someone in the comments, unknown to me, said, and not an Irish person amongst them, on commenting on the panel. And I don't know if that's true. Actually, if anyone wants to put their hand up as Irish, please do. So I just wanted to say, on behalf of the absent Irish people on this stage, that Oscar Wilde was Irish. His mother was an Irish nationalist who collected Irish folk literature. He grew up in a settler colonial state. It had Trinity College Dublin, where he was a student, was only accessible really to people who were members of the Church of England. It was possible for Catholics to attend, but they couldn't receive scholarships, they couldn't take on lectureships. And it was only about 3 years before he arrived at Oxford that it became permissible for Catholics to attend Oxford University. So there's a story of ethnic discrimination that we don't talk about very much in relationship to Wilde, but I just wanted to, in this last moment, put that on the stage and then hand over to Christos.
Oh, Alexis, I'm so grateful you said that. I think that's actually a really important part of the Oscar Wilde story that doesn't become part of how we talk of it. So thank you very much for that. And Tobias, one of my favourite novels, like beloved, is Margaret Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian, which is for me, I just say to people, you want to know how to write history, that's where you begin.
Read it. Everyone read this book, please.
What was wonderful about tonight is I just have 100 questions that I want to go and ask you all over a wine, which is great. And one of them, David, is, and I'm not asking, but I want how you do class in dance and ballet. I would like, because I want to know about how the story I would like to tell about Wilde is not through Wilde, it's not through Lord Douglas, it's possibly through his wife, but it would be, who were those young men in those beds? And I would like to know how we tell that story.
I'm not going to answer that question, Christos, I'm sorry.
No, but maybe after, I don't know why.
I just, Friday the 13th of September, 14 shows at the Regent Theatre on Collins Street. This isn't my selfish plug, but it's just been a very fruitful partnership. We've learned so much, and we're telling a bold, unapologetic story through the beauty of the classical art form, classical technique. So that's it.
I'll make one last comment before Clare comes back. My friend Jonathan Mills, the composer, wrote a piece recently in which he said Oscar Wilde was the only critic who would review a show before he'd seen it. And I am going to follow Oscar Wilde's example. I have not seen Oscar the Ballet, but it's going to be wonderful.
Great. Thank you, Dennis.